Good morning. Oh, gotta get the recording out of the way. Good morning, good day, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to Merkle Meets. My name is Robert Whitaker. I'm the Director of Law Enforcement Affairs over here at Merkle Science. This morning, we have two very special guests that have been in the compliance and the crypto industry for a really long time. We have Aidan Larkin, co-founder and CEO of Asset Reality. I've worked with Asset Reality many times, excellent company. And then we have Iggy Azad, Senior Director of Intelligence over at Coinbase, another outstanding resource and an excellent guy. I know Iggy. I've actually known Iggy for quite a while now, but yeah, two great people in the crypto space. And I will leave it to them to give their actual introductions because I don't want to end up destroying their reputation. So why don't we start with that? Aidan, you want to start off first with a little intro of who you are, what you're doing, and what Asset Reality is about?
Sure, I'd love to. So Asset Reality, we're building the operating system for asset recovery, and it sounds quite a vague and sort of lofty sort of idea. But basically, globally, we see lots of assets seized after all of the hard work that goes into investigations and prosecutions. Governments have struggled throughout the years, as have insolvency practitioners, court receivers. That last leg of actually recovering the asset and getting, whether it's money back to victims, money back into law enforcement, disrupting serious and organized crime. That piece has been a big sort of struggle, and it's much debated as to how much is actually recovered. And there's lots of single-digit statistics, but everyone's unanimously in agreement that asset recovery has had a number of challenges. So Asset Reality exists just to try and make it easier to seize assets, and obviously digital assets by value take up such a big part of that now. But we help governments recover all sorts of assets around the world. Previously, I worked in criminal investigation in revenue and customs in the UK. And then more recently, in between times, I was the UK asset manager. So helping government agencies manage their portfolios of Bitcoins to Bentleys, and had the privilege of being involved in some of the early UK crypto cases, and getting to deal with all sorts of fun assets back before all the days of the regulation and everything. And I know we're going to talk about that. So I'm a practitioner. I do not have the sort of experience that Iggy has on the investigation side, but I have experience in just setting up asset management agencies around the world and helping people build their infrastructure.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's going to be a blooming industry here shortly. I think we've always struggled with the assets. What do you do afterwards? Everyone loves to do the cool stuff, which is go out and make the cases and do the arresting, that kind of stuff. But after that, you're like, what do we do now, gentlemen? And that creates a problem sometimes. So, yeah, thank you very much, Iggy. Good morning or good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Rob and the Merkle team, for having me here today. So I'm an investigator at Coinbase. I've been here for about nearly 7 years. I manage a team of investigators who deal with all kinds of threats and investigations, from terrorism financing all the way over to fraud, intelligence collection, dissemination, working with partners within the cryptocurrency industry and also within public sector as well. Part of our role is to deal with all law enforcement requests for information, as well as dealing with realization of assets on our platform in pursuant of criminal cases. Prior to Coinbase, I was in the police in London in the cybercrime unit for about, in total, 20 years. There I ran a team of investigators dealing with all kinds of cybercrime issues and threats, from low level all the way up to nation state and some of the hacktivist groups as well. I started my cryptocurrency journey probably around the end of 2013, where the first cryptocurrency cases came across our desk. And from there, I've been able to present on experiences and our methods within the police, as well as Coinbase, at various different conferences around the world. And happy to be in. And what I would say is, if you have any questions, please do ask. This is the right forum. We have a fairly small group, so we'd like to have interaction wherever we can. Thank you.
Yeah, this is absolutely the right place to do it. I mean, if you try to contact either one of these two fine gentlemen after this, you may or may not get a response, depending on whether the email goes to. So if you have a question, this is a great time to ask two great resources. Gentlemen, I'm going to dive right in here into kind of the summary of what we're going to talk about today, and then I got a whole list of questions here. So, we've seen the payment institutions engaging with crypto all over the world now. We see stable coins jumping out there. Digital wallets, fiat-to-crypto rails are kind of the new thing. Well, they're not new in a sense that they've been around for a while, but people are really becoming aware of them lately. But because of that, we also have the heightened exposure, and we have laundering networks that are getting better and better. Cross-border regulatory risk. I mean, we've all seen that, and Iggy, I know for sure that Coinbase knows about that. So, and you do too as well. So, let's start off real quick this morning with, and I'm going to run this through Iggy first. Typologies and scale. So let's talk about 25 and 26. So 26 is rather new, and we just discussed this briefly earlier. But how's 26 going versus 25? And in 25, what was the typology? What did you see the most of? What was happening out there?
So 2026 so far has been, thankfully, as we would say in the police, very Q. We don't say the actual full word, ends in a T. It's got 5 letters in case something happens. What we've seen in 2025 is just an increase in the volume of funds that have been stolen by either nation-state actors. We can look to, for example, the Bybit hack in North Korea, through to things like account takeovers and fraud. Coinbase hasn't been immune from that, as we can see from some public reporting last year in May. The scale of account takeovers and how they target individuals has become more sophisticated, looking at high net worth individuals, those people who post their wealth either on chain or on social media. They make themselves vulnerable. And what we've seen is that we've observed the transition from this being a cybercrime space and dealing with illicit funds of cryptocurrency to real world crime. We've seen increases in, for example, robberies and kidnaps, where people who have high net worth within cryptocurrency are being targeted, kidnapped, and their funds are being taken. Some occasions, it's been quite opportunistic, whereby this is taking place in a street crime scenario, where we used to see the old school robbery teams. They now will look at cryptocurrency holdings because it's an app on people's phone. So in terms, very, very broadly in a nutshell, it's become more complex in terms of the different industries now involved in the criminal fraternity, in the whole end-to-end process of the crime. Whereas before, the individual conducting the hack or the account takeover would also deal with the laundering of the funds. We now have little cottage industries replicating what we saw in ransomware. People who do the attack planning, people who do the phishing or the social engineering, through to the people who do the actual hack, through to the laundering networks. And we've seen laundering as a service spring up across the world, as well as proliferation of underground banking, cash to crypto desks, services such as bridges, swappers. They've all increased in number, not to say that they're illicit by very definition, but their services are being misused, much like any other exchange.
Yeah, that's very interesting the way you frame that. This is not the rather elementary system of stealing and laundering that you might expect in a nascent space. This is very complicated these days. It's certainly grown since the 2013 days, and I think you and I both can speak to that. So yes, absolutely. Aiden, you want to weigh in on that? Go ahead, sir.
Simply a reflection of the complexity of the ecosystem that we have. We've gone from being 2 chains, Bitcoin, ETH, maybe some stablecoins thrown in, to multiple different chains across EVM, Sol, and the different services and products that are being offered. There's multiple opportunities for people to launder their funds, should they so wish to, using things like liquidity pools, coin swappers, bridges, etc. The complexity is a reflection of the complex environment and the complex products out there.
Yeah, complex products. I'm going to throw this out there for kind of food for thought, but if anyone really watches the valuation of coins, you've seen Zcash, Monero, and coins like Mimblewimble and Grin actually gain in value over the last couple of years, which is interesting. I'm not going to put a blame to it. I don't know why it's happening, but certainly it's interesting to watch how the scale of money laundering in the crypto world grows, and so does some of the more privacy-focused coins. No disrespect for those coins or the people who launched them. Just saying that it's interesting to watch the comparison there. Aiden, sir.
Yeah, I'm happy to give our perspective on that, and I think Iggy's sort of summed it up really well. That it's the natural maturity of the ecosystem. We've gone from a handful of assets to very, very complicated, interconnected sort of financial instruments. Now, our perspective is a little bit different in the sense of we're usually at the back end when the actual seizure is taking place. So it means that we naturally, usually we run chronologically a couple of years behind by very virtue of, the crime is reported, it's investigated, people get their search warrants and they go and seize assets. So our touch point is usually for someone that's done something, whether it's a real-time case or it's something that's been investigated for a number of months or years in some instances. But we're seeing now those just the sheer complexity. I mean, the gone are the days when you could expect what you were going to be seizing. I mean, literally just a couple of days ago, we had an agency in the US where an officer, their first ever seizure, and it's things like rewards NFT, and it's just getting into tokens no one's even heard of, really, really obscure amounts. Whereas that used to be the outlier. Now, whether that's a level of maturity from the criminals and laundering trying to put assets beyond reach, it's probably not as black and white as that. It's probably just that people who are involved in scams and criminals have just wide portfolios of assets themselves. But it means then the law enforcement reaction just becomes more complex because you have to have now that understanding of how to safely recover a ridiculously complex sort of range of assets. And it would be lovely to sit and say that no, all the cases are all big, massive, disruptive cases where hundreds of millions of dollars are being seized. Just like everything, it's the boring stuff that doesn't necessarily grab the headlines. And the vast majority of seizures, and we have sort of 18 months worth of data now of of folks who are using our platform to seize assets. And I mean, the vast majority of cases are tiny, tiny amounts. Like it is very common to see $100 seizures, $500 seizures, $1,000 seizures. Again, because as law enforcement, you can't leave behind. You wouldn't leave $1,000 in cash in the property if you're investigating a criminal. So they're having to take those assets as well. So I think that on one side, we're seeing the complexity of the sort of the journey that the officers are going through in terms of the seizures. And this also bleeds into insolvency cases and attorneys and like the FTX style cases where people are appointed on court appointments to deal with assets. That's getting more complicated, but then I suppose that's almost counterbalanced by the fact that there is lots of good examples now of what good looks like. So lots of people can talk to their colleagues, things like Operation Shamrock, someone who's doing a seizure for the first time that hasn't done a seizure before can pick up the phone and call one of their counterparts in another state and local organization and say, what did you do? How did you get through this? So some things are becoming a little bit, I don't want to use the word easier, but certainly there's a well-trodden path. And then we are seeing sort of just more and more complex assets being seized. And it's also very encouraging because it shows that like the appetite to take on these more complicated assets, criminals aren't able to put it beyond reach because they stored in a complicated way. I think the opposite thing that's maybe worth drawing on as a reflection of 2025 and what 2026 is going to look like. You now have a sort of interesting new forcing factor, certainly in our world, of around asset management as well, where you now have an EU directive that means governments have to have a designated entity to manage assets. Even in the UK, they've now created the first asset management office. Obviously, the US has had this for decades with entities like the US Marshals. So we're seeing that is going to drive probably more seizure activity, which is a great thing because it obviously tackles illicit assets and takes them out of the ecosystem. And I think just lastly then is around the new risk, as Iggy sort of mentioned, you're seeing just a plethora of different types of situations that lead to seizures or people being attacked to get their cold storage wallet off them. We're also seeing that risk where there are exploits when people are actually seizing assets. We've supported many cases where an insolvency practitioner or an attorney or someone without a lot of experience is maybe doing their first seizure and there's a mistake and the assets are lost, or there's an exploit and they're being tricked. Or we've seen cases where widely reported, and it happens in every industry, where people who are responsible for the seizure are stealing the asset. And we've seen lots of cases which are actually really good investigation work because the departments found the people, caught the people doing it as well. But it just means that overall, getting bigger and sort of getting slightly more complicated is probably the overall sort of summary of 2025 from my perspective.
Wow, you went from very uncomplicated to complicated, just right up the line.
I'm
That's
back.
very very good. When you said that you're seeing a lot of small seizures like the $100, 500,000, that kind of stuff. That is like music to my ears because it feels like that law enforcement's finally getting the message. When you serve a warrant, when you serve any kind of process, you may not see $1 million of crypto sitting somewhere. It might just be, a couple dollars worth of ETH sitting in a wallet somewhere. And you're right, you wouldn't just leave it there. You would seize it. Certainly, if it's part of the illicit funds that you're looking for, you would seize it. So it's nice to hear that because that means we're getting a little more granular on the seizures and actually getting that work done. So music to my ears. Certainly, when we talk about seizures and the complexity of the more complex assets out there. Um, you're right. When I talk to a lot of law enforcement out there, it's hard enough to sometimes get the understanding of Ethereum across, or even Bitcoin sometimes in the UTXO model. So really getting someone or the resources out there for law enforcement to, or even anyone doesn't have to be law enforcement to seize much more complicated assets is music to my ears. So thank you very much for you guys doing that. Iggy, I wanted to come back to you because this is something that you would definitely have a lot of knowledge of. When there's a hack or something, or someone loses a substantial amount of money, maybe you guys get involved, maybe you don't, but I'm sure you know about it anyway. What happens after the hack, after the compromise has been made? There's no, I see it all the time. There's hundreds sometimes of transactions going on in all different ways, and you got a piece going here and a piece going there, and gas flying here, and all these transactions going on. That is mostly automated, right?
So I think there's elements of automation in sort of large scale hacks that take place, but we also see some quite manual behavior. If you go back to, for example, look at some of the DPRK hacks, just as an example, you'll see funds will be parked for a very long period of time and then they'll move. So
Mm.
there's a deliberate act around parking the funds, setting up the back end, and there's probably elements of automation in there. Or in the case of, for example, DPRK, a huge amount of resources in terms of individuals who are able to then say, I'm taking that 10K Bitcoin, I'm taking that 10K Bitcoin. I'll be responsible for multiple different paths of laundering from there.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So, breaking it down, it's almost like a well-run machine, right? Certainly in the case of a DPRK, I'm sure they're not flying by night. They're probably
No.
have a whole plan in place before this even happens.
But
Um,
those sort of methodologies are filtering down to normal cybercrime. Again, we see the automation in terms of multiple different wallets being set up, and then funds from an initial compromise or account takeover are then filtered into those different wallets, and then it splinters off into some will go to bridge over to another chain, some will be swapped out, some will be swapped to Monero, some will continue on the ETH train. There may be consolidations further down the path, and then again we'll have a deliberate pause. They've tried this avenue, this avenue, and this avenue. Maybe they've been blocked, maybe they haven't. There's a pause, there's a consolidation of funds, then they start again with rapid movements. And of course, there's going to be automation at play in there. You'd be foolish not to, if you're a criminal, to try and amplify your abilities on chain and also off chain as well. In terms of the vectors of attack, you'd use automation in order to generate your phishing email, or for example, you use AI tools to generate your phish and then your website
yeah.
and then bring the victims in. So there's elements of AI or automation at various points throughout that chain, but definitely see automation. You can certainly see it in terms of the patterns of behavior, the timing, and how the funds move. And then obviously further down the line, the consolidations as well.
Yeah. It's very interesting when we're talking about AI and automation. What you have a vast amount of experience. So, without implicating Coinbase and what you guys are doing, because that's not it's not what we're doing here. We're just trying to dig knowledge out of your brain, Iggy. So, what do you see coming at us? What is this something that keeps you up at night? What's coming at us, or what? How do you feel about that?
So in terms of what I'm most concerned about is probably a very basic thing, but the level of attribution coverage within all the major tools out there and how much visibility you actually have on chain. We can throw a ballpark figure: 35 to 40% of all chains are attributed to an entity. So that's an entity you can reach out to and say, hey, do you know about this transaction? that leaves a vast amount that's unattributed. And
Mhm.
are, how will we improve that level of attribution across all the chains? And then if we look at particular chains, for example, Solana, which is a huge beast, you know,
Yeah.
millions, billions of addresses in different marketplaces, and it operates so quickly. How do we stay ahead of it? So the main concern for me is the attribution element of those tools. How do you know that address is what we say it is? And some providers maybe more scrupulous than others, maybe more stringent on their attribution. How can we be sure about that attribution? If, for example, law enforcement is basing an outreach or a court order based on an attribution from a provider, how can they reassure themselves that's actually true?
Yeah, that's an interesting concept, and I do have one follow-up question for Iggy, and then I'm coming over to Aiden on the same topic. So prepare your answer, Aiden. Uh, Iggy, when you talk about attribution, I think there's two frames of thought. I've been in the analytics space for a lot of years now, and on one side you see people say, well, we need to be 100% sure or as close as possible to who owns this address as we can. And then there's the other side that says, well, we're just trying to give them the best information we can. If there's a sliver of a thought that it might belong to X, we should provide that sliver. So it might be the piece that breaks the case, if you will. What do you think about that?
There's two ways to look at it because that's looking at it from the criminal point of view. But as we know, civil cases are increasing in volume as well, involving cryptocurrency, where they're basing a lot of their analysis on expert reports, who in turn base their analysis on the attributions provided by the tools. So you can look at it in two ways. You've got criminal, and in the UK, it's beyond guilty verdicts, and within the civil case, balance of probabilities. It's a very different bar thresholds you're looking at. So how can you be sure in a civil case that the attribution has been provided to you? Maybe it's an unresponsive provider, is what it says it is. How can you dig into the information behind it? What's the provenance? Where did they get it from? How do I know, for example, not throwing names out there, or how do I know that address is Coinbase? They haven't responded to any requests from us on a civil basis to then justify making that order. Then looking at it from the criminal point of view, yeah, you could certainly say, well, we're only providing the best information from the investigator to make a determination and inform their next steps. Okay. What if those next steps is actually a legal order that they're using from? Are you as a provider going to stand up in court and provide all that information? Maybe it's based, for example, from UXTO tracing on your heuristics. Are you willing to openly declare in court your heuristics and the basis for it? Did you test it? How many times did you test it? Did you get independent verification?
Mm-hmm.
Didn't. But if you're using, for example, an ML machine learning model in the background, what went into that ML model? How did you train it? What data did you feed? What's the
Yeah.
redundancy? What's the error rate on it?
Yeah, you sound like me all of a sudden. But that's the thing. That's what I say when we're talking about attribution. If you want to provide the information, fine. And if law enforcement wants to accept it, but they should not just take our word for it. They should go try to back it up. We had the word called this parallel reconstruction, right? Like get the information, kind of reconstruct it. So it's kind of the same concept, I think. Yeah. So yeah, thank you very much for that. I think that is a lot of good information that we just unpacked. Aiden, and you obviously heard what we're talking. You want to take a stab at that? At all of it?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, I think a point that is certainly that I'm qualified to talk about it. I don't like talking about stuff I'm not qualified to, so I'm certainly not going to try and talk about investigations in crypto because it's not my field at all. But I definitely think that an interesting point that Iggy's raised is around the use of sort of civil recovery tools and sort of civil forfeiture mechanisms. The new FATF guidance, there's almost a mandatory requirement coming into countries to utilize non-conviction based forfeiture and similar tools. Now, there's two ways to look at that. On one side, some of the biggest crypto seizures in history have been through a civil forfeiture mechanism for precisely the reason that Iggy had mentioned in terms of the lower burden of proof, where you've already proven a criminal offense and you've got your predicate offense in the bag and they have this asset. So you can take an action against that asset, and then the asset is famously sort of forfeited to the government, or it can be forfeited, and then victims can be paid from that. So there's a definite use, and we see lots and lots of people excitedly getting involved and going after these cases. And I think where there could be a big risk is a little knowledge being a dangerous thing. And I think we're seeing, different, a lot of this politically motivated, but people thinking, and again, back to Iggy's point on attribution, not being maybe where people think it is that you've got governments now going, oh, we're seeing this big things in the press, or no, a country beginning with V. There's all these things happening right now. Well, why don't we just go over and why don't we just grab all of these assets and we could just go to the stablecoin issuer and we could say we suspect they're involved in crime and we'll use civil recovery mechanisms or civil forfeiture mechanisms. And all of a sudden, to what Iggy sort of summarized quite well, there's a lot still to unpack and there's still a lot to be done. So I don't think civil recovery and civil forfeiture is going to be a silver bullet in any extent. But I do think in those cases where there is attribution and you can go and you can prove, we've seen some brilliant cases brought to conclusion quite quickly because it is a case of this is undeniably linked to this person, to this identity, to this individual, to this instance. And all of a sudden you've got, on one side, the most traceable asset in the world, but it's only when it's actually attributed. So it has so much potential and so many things can go well. But similarly, we see a lot of cases that are just infuriatingly close, but the agencies just can't get there. We've been involved in many cases where assets are seized and then the assets have to get returned as well, and the assets have to go back to the accused because they haven't been able to get that conviction. But then sometimes that trickles down into a civil forfeiture. Or the famous catch-all around the world is, you can't get them for the crimes, you get them for tax. So we see that interaction where you have a cash seizure and some crypto seized because it's frozen at an exchange, and the person can't prove how they funded those assets. So that's where civil recovery and civil forfeiture comes in and can often be a really good mechanism as well. But yeah, I think it's going to be it's not without its challenges, but there is a lot of governmental pressure now over the next sort of 5 to 7 years when countries' mutual evaluation, people will have to produce statistics on their use of non-conviction based forfeiture. And there's been a growing sort of theme that crypto is going to save the day for all of this and give people a lot of their stats. And it's not going to be as easy as that because we're still 2026, still many government agencies can't afford analytic tools. They don't have the training, or they have 2 or 3 people who are responsible for receiving all of the crypto related SARs and suspicious activity reports in smaller jurisdictions as well. So asset recovery for a century has been dogged by resource issues, and we're still in the same position. It's still fundamentally a resource issue. And what is AI, machine learning, and programmatic filing of SARs and things going to do when now we're seeing thousands of SARs coming in, to again countries that have 1 or 2 people using a free tool or a free explorer to try and unpick these really complicated SARs. So I think that there's lots of opportunities in asset recovery, but it would be wrong of me to say that it's going to be an easy route. There's still a hell of a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, I think the optimum word there is attribution. Attribution both on the side of entities owning addresses, and then because that leads you to like the holy grail, right? KYC. But then there's also the side like attribution, like how do we attribute this to a person? Whole different world, whole different type of provenance we're talking about there. So getting it from here to there and making the connection is not always as easy as people would say. Iggy, I see your hand up, sir.
Yeah, it's also about attribution of the illicit products and services out there. Sometimes a new market will be set up, darknet market. Don't know the addresses for it. That sort of concerted effort around research and analysis for the betterment of everyone in the cryptocurrency sector is something that's kind of missing, because obviously in a competitive environment, the different analytics tools are in competition with each other, each competing on types of coverage, levels of coverage. We're better at TF, we're better at CSAM, for example. Maybe there's an argument that maybe we come together on some of those high harm threats and consolidate some of that learning and information so that everyone within public and private sector can better protect their platforms. There's other ways to compete in terms of heuristics, for example, which certainly might be an argument, but it's not just the traditional services that need attributing, it's all the illicit ones as well, the mixing services. Sometimes we can infer from the blockchain to what it is, but that's not a confident, that is BitMixer, that is best mixer. So those would be my thoughts on terms of attribution, but looking wider than just products and services. What about the illicit ones?
Yeah, I've always been a fan of analytics companies actually talking with each other when it comes to certain types of attribution. CSAM being one of them. I'm like, you know what? This is a public this is a public safety thing. We should all just share that. I've always been a fan of that, but there's other ones that maybe not, like an OTC desk in Kosovo or something. I mean, that is like attribution that they paid money to get, and it's theirs, right? So they went and got it, and that's good for them. So, and this stuff's expensive, just like a lot of law enforcement looks at me and says, "What do you mean this costs X amount of dollars per year?" And I'm like, "Well, there's a back end, there's a front end, there's business development, there's attribution finding. This stuff's expensive. It's not like it just can't, someone's computer's running this. This stuff is really expensive, especially when you have really good attribution. It costs money to do that kind of stuff. So,
But
yeah,
also, the public sector is probably sitting on a mine of attribution data which they could share. And
I bet they are.
why aren't they?
Yeah, exactly. And I bet places like you said, the public sector. And I'm thinking some of these large banking institutions, financial institutions around the world, they have a ton of attribution as well. I don't think there will be a day anytime soon that we all just throw our attribution in a pool, because then we're talking about how we got it again. But there's
There is,
obviously more to
yeah,
do.
but I think that there is a playbook for a lot of this stuff. If you park digital assets, I mean, from a banking perspective, again, as a regular financial investigator, I mean, I was involved in the UK has an organization called the GIMLET, as the Joint Money Laundering, like, Interagency Task Force. Um, but it was the banking sector where you did have, exactly like Iggy talked about his former career and now working in the private sector, where you would have people that were sitting from some of the biggest banks in the world. And it usually was very senior decorated detectives that were now running, and was the head of financial crime for HSBC, the head of financial crime for Barclays or Standard Chartered or whatever. And they have exactly the same challenges. They're all, competing private entities. They're sometimes public companies, and they have their own data, but they are coming together, and they will sit at round tables, and they will stand try and figure out. And I mean, the whole public-private partnership thing has been sort of played to death, and everyone talks about it. And
Yeah,
what does it actually mean? So we are seeing, I mean, the UK this year has the illicit finance summit that is being hosted sort of from a government perspective. They're hosting this, and the idea is trying to tackle illicit finance, and obviously digital assets being a massive portion of that. So there is that debate right now on, how do all of these large agencies overcome, parking commercial interests, just like, societal good. How do they legally share the information? Because what happens if, if Iggy's employers are asked to share information with another entity, and all of a sudden that person isn't convicted, and that person then sues and says you weren't allowed to release my information? And so I still think there's a lot of, and we've built these frameworks, is that there is a lot of challenges and difficulties around sharing information. But there is a good playbook, I think, that, but also with a dose of reality, that we're still having these conversations about illicit finance, and it's helping around a hell of a lot longer, and we still haven't got a magic solution as to how information is shared. And I completely agree with Iggy on the sense of there's a lot of information sitting on the other side of the fence that isn't shared and collaborated on. But there is, I think, a shout out to things like, I mean, Europol and others have done things like, these sort of collaborative approaches where they do bring, multiple sectors together and try and have
mm,
specific Project Asset being one of the big ones, where they're actually sitting working on joint operations together and pulling data and trying to go after targets. Interpol has brought out its Silver Notice for tracing assets. So there's definitely movements going in the right direction that matches the level of adoption and scale of the challenges. But yeah, we always weather that with a bit of, we've had these challenges for decades in fiat. And again, we haven't quite got the magic solution yet. So we have to be realistic about the pace. And I know there's a bunch of questions coming in that are within line with a lot of those things, that there's
mm,
not going to be a magic crypto solution. Although some things we can do much quicker, other things will still fall into the same asset recovery challenges as everything else, like sharing information overseas. There are existing legal challenges. There is no fast way to get crypto information from one country to another. You have to put in a legal, application, and these things just take time, whether it's a digital asset request or a real estate request.
yeah. Iggy, I see your hand up again.
I would say that, however, the UK, in terms of the Proceeds of Crime Act, does provide a framework for seizure of assets, criminal assets, but using civil forfeiture powers.
Yeah.
So, for example, if a entity, whether it's a bank or a cryptocurrency exchange in the UK, identifies an amount of assets which they suspect come from illicit finance, they can freeze the accounts and tell law enforcement. Now, that's part of the process. The other part of the process is that law enforcement has to take notice of that report and go and seek a freezing order. It used to happen quite a lot with fiat and does happen with fiat. With cryptocurrency, not as much. So there are ways in which that information, particularly around the recovery of illicit funds, can be done effectively. But that is an outlier. The UK is the only jurisdiction which has that process, and it's a formalized legal process with penalties for non-compliance. And I find it very, very effective in identifying illicit finance because the registered entity has to do so, has to follow the law.
Yeah, that's like a SAR on steroids. It's like a make the report, seize the assets, and tell someone about it, right? That's interesting. I didn't know that. That's very interesting, gentlemen. I'm gonna kind of extend on what we're talking about, and that's attribution, but also this little thing called privacy. Iggy, I see your hand still up. You got something else? Oh, okay. You just so when in the opinion of both of you, so anyone can take this question, at what point does attribution become privacy related? So we have entities, right? I don't think entities have much privacy, certainly not in the blockchain space where everything's public, but and someone tags a name to say this is their hot wallet. But what about putting a more private institution or maybe PII to an attribution? Anybody want to take that?
Depends for the actor. For me, I'm not a lawyer. It depends where that attribution comes from. If it's coming from open source, I'll do it all day and night and attribute that address as an individual. And that has been done before. If you just go on Etherscan, a lot of people will add their ENS domain to their address.
Yeah.
That ENS domain is usually their name. Plus, you get people posting on Twitter about this is my wallet, look at my bags, or how much money I've got. There is other identifiable information in Telegram chats, in forums, Bitcoin Talk, etc. If that information is already out there, I will take it and I'll attribute it, whether it contains PII or not, because it's verifiable information that anyone could come across. The difficulty is when you're using PII from, for example, within your own company. That would be a no, because you are then breaching privacy guidelines. But if it's open source, you can find it. It's fair game.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. Yeah, that's right. And in fact, I've always been a proponent of going out and scraping, like the channels and picking up handles. And if someone is out there or anyone's out there and they want to post their name and an address with it, well, you've just made a fair game for the rest of us. That's my feeling about it, and that's my personal opinion. So, yeah. So we have, gentlemen, about 13 minutes until we get to questions. So I'm going to throw out another question here. Freezing intervention. I think Aiden is probably the one to take this one on. When is intervention or freezing justified in crypto cases? And what practical or cross-border constraints most often block the action? So this is actually both of you. You both have run into this, and this is probably more of your daily routine than we expect.
Like I was going to say, by sheer volume and experience, Iggy and Coinbase are going to see all of the front end, but I can just perhaps give the asset recovery sort of perspective in terms of constraints. And it was just what I was alluding to in my last comment around, I mean, there is no sort of silver bullet for crypto asset recovery right now. If you want to get information of an exchange that's registered in a foreign jurisdiction, the legal way, of course, there's informal channels where you can just get a nod, or law enforcement to law enforcement can say, is it worth my while submitting a request? And there's lots of networks and things that sit in Europol, like the Karen network, where prosecutors and people can talk to counterparts and just try and sort of shorten the cycle of getting information. But fundamentally, if you want actionable information that you can go and use and rely on, we know neither of us are lawyers, but you still have to go through those formal legal processes. And sometimes it is a case of you file it and it could be 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. Now, as Iggy mentioned earlier, when you have an asset category that is moving in seconds and is being distributed across multiple networks and just across multiple platforms and vendors and third parties, one of the big focuses with FATF, and it's in their language on the new asset recovery guidance, is the ability to seize expeditiously. So countries are now being measured on their ability and demonstrating. And again, like we've seen for years, just because FATF say something doesn't mean that automatically it's perfect and everything's fixed. But there is now a new focus on asset recovery from FATF's point of view, and one of those pieces was around acting quickly to secure digital assets before they are moved. So we've seen some innovations in certain jurisdictions where the financial intelligence unit has the ability to put a soft freeze. And we've seen this play out with some of our clients in certain countries where, foreign government agency sends a request to the AFIU in the jurisdiction where the exchange is present. They're able to take that information and say, can you hold this? And they have legislation, they have statute that they can use to say, we have a suspicion. Can you please put a soft freeze on the account? The cooperating exchange will say, we'll put a soft freeze on for a few days. And it allows them basically to get to court, look at it, understand it. And as you talked earlier on, Robert, about the parallel investigation, is there enough information there that there's a crime here, or whatever other checks and balances they have to carry out? So we're seeing, which is good news, a sort of renewed focus on looking at the infrastructure. Can you seize assets more quickly? Again, one of the reasons we exist is to help governments do that and be on hand so that whatever the token is, no matter how complicated it is or how weird and wonderful or low value it is, they've got to seize it. So we are seeing the mechanics being put in place to try and speed up seizures. But again, it goes back to the wider asset recovery challenge. Ask every investigator who's ever been involved in an international investigation. It takes years sometimes to resolve some of these issues. It takes years sometimes to get funds repatriated in big anti-corruption cases and big investigations. But we are seeing in crypto cases those things being accelerated. And the point that you made about the UK, I mean, there are governments being very proactive and issuing very specific guidance around the treatment of digital assets, which is very welcome. So I think we're seeing that the plumbing and the infrastructure is being improved to make it easier from a certain digital asset perspective. But again, there's a lot of countries to get around, and it's going to take a bit of time before it's all fully embedded. And there is also bad actors that will just move from that country to the next country. And you'll just see that international whack-a-mole where we're seeing the bad players turn up in the most obscure. And it used to be that it was offshore, and now it's like it's tiny small Pacific islands that most people have never heard of are now becoming home to lots of registered entities. So yeah, the whack-a-mole will continue, but it seems like the net's certainly tightening.
Yeah, I've found out there's a lot of little countries out in the South Pacific somewhere all of a sudden that have a lot of interest in people moving there.
Well, there's a funny square of the circle. A friend of he's Nick Furno, my co-founder. Nick's first book, Investigating Cryptocurrencies, he talks about the island of Yap and Palau and all of those, and as the origin of the Rye stones and as this comparable to the first blockchain. The irony that it now as a country has PO box exchanges, bad exchanges, and dodgy companies being set up and using that tiny little island now. We're seeing the same in Cook Islands and all places. But yeah, nowhere is safe now because with an internet connection and a company formation agent, you can set a company up anywhere in the world.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So very interesting. The whole freezing assets. Iggy, back to you, but I think at a more of a case level concept. When is justifying crypto really justified? And we talked about that. Aiden just talked about the soft freeze and that kind of stuff. And I'm sure Coinbase gets plenty of them. I'm sure you've probably seen a ton of them. And we haven't codified that law, so there's no codification of soft freezing, or is there? So when in your opinion, is it okay to start saying, "Hey, we should freeze this," or they just haven't come to grips with the reality that we're not going to do it?
So to kind of set the scene, if you're dealing with a centralized exchange, they'll have many, many different levers and restrictions and frictions they can apply to account, both for criminal and civil cases. And we have to look at it from both avenues because the recovery is sometimes different, sometimes quicker as well. So if you're working in an exchange, first of all, understand what you can apply to an account. And yet there's this term banning as soft freeze. Sometimes it's kind of a meaningless term. It's either a freeze or it's not, or you're preventing assets from moving from that account. Either way, whether you put something else on a flag that's not a freeze, or otherwise, if you're restricting movement of assets, it's a freeze. I think when cops say a soft freeze, because they don't want to send an order just yet, they want to test the waters a little bit, generate some activity. That's by the by. Talk to us first. So if you work in exchange, understand what controls, what frictions, what restrictions you can apply. If you're an investigator, understand your counterparts, those people in the industry. What are they happy and comfortable doing for you on an email, on a phone call, on a one-to-one basis. Now, where is it justified? That's going to be down to a case-by-case basis. If we look at the most high harm, for example, money laundering from, for example, TF, there's no holds barred. You're going to freeze that. You've got verifiable information. This funds comes from, for example, terrorism fundraising, or an entity or organization that's linked to TF or terrorism fundraising or terrorism. You're going to put a freeze on, or a sanctioned entity. You're going to put the freeze on. You cannot risk that. Where, for example, that sliding scale moves down, for example, a fraud, have they actually traced the funds from fraud? More often than not, they've gone through, and it goes to my point around attribution, unnamed services, or it's consolidated with something else, or they've done an incorrect trace through a bridge, or they've gone through a mixer. So then the level of confidence drops a lot more. So it really does depend on a case-by-case basis. If you are an investigator in this audience, you work at another exchange, the best way to overcome this, have a conversation. I keep saying this, have a conversation, an honest one, about what you've seen, how you've traced it, and then we can take it step by step. And if the attribution is there, if the context is there, I will put a freeze on with or without an order. But then that comes the element of trust. You then have to deliver an order, whether you're a cop or a civil investigator. You've got to deliver an order.
That's very good. Have the conversation, right? Just reach out, make the phone call if you can, send an email and say, let's have a call, and then see what you can do one to one and make something happen. And you're right, it comes down to trust. Did the investigator, is it a good trace? Do they know for sure, or is this just something that they feel like, we're going to freeze that money? Well, tell me why. Tell me why and how we got here, and maybe we will, maybe we won't. So yeah, gentlemen, we have several questions. Is Aiden's still with us? I just shrunk my screen a little bit so I can put some more writing up there so I can see it. Sorry, I'm like, where'd he go? No, there he is.
I had to
go. So we have just a little bit of time left. I'm going to go ahead and get some of these questions because we have several of them. So the first one from Muhammad, being a non-U.S. resident, how to report a crypto scam against a firm allegedly registered in the U.S. to help increase the chances of asset tracing and recovery. Any of you two want to take it, or should I take it?
You can report to the US law enforcement agency. There's many different avenues to do so. I'd probably look at the IC3 website from the FBI, where you can submit a report. Secondly, depending on the country you're in, report to your local agency. They can then pass the information on to Europol. Put as much information as context. Why do you suspect they're involved in it? What's the volume? Because unfortunately, we do work in a numbers environment. The bigger the number, the more attention that you're going to get. But make sure those numbers are verifiable. Unfortunately, if you're talking a $1 million loss, you may not get that much attention. If you say 10 to 20 million, you're probably going to get more attention. If you have that entity or that organization with exposure to multiple other different laundering networks or illicit finance or high harm, high risk illicit finance, again, going back to terrorism, you'd like to get more attention.
Very, very, very true. So in the U.S., you can certainly go to IC3 and make a report there. And depending on the loss, really depends on whether you'll hear anything back. There's $1 million loss, to be honest with the entire world in the crypto space, is not that big of a loss. I know it is if you're the person that lost it. Trust me, if you lost it, it's massive. But in the scheme of things, it's not going to be something that a lot of agencies want to pick up. So yeah, loss and the context around that loss. If you lost it, giving it to a terrorist organization, you're probably going to get some notice. But if you lost it to an investment scam or something like that, it depends. So yeah, very, very good. Aiden, I have a question just for you. It says, Aiden, if crypto is treated as evidence, let's see, that's trying to get this right. At what point, let's see, crypto is treated as evidence and governments want to take a piece of it, just a normal cash seizure, and they keep the seized assets, but they forget the victims, so they can't keep it. So I guess the question really is around, evidence and the governments and seizures and victims.
Yeah, there's a couple of processes. I don't think they're alluding to the fact that the government is trying to deliberately sort of
Yeah, I
forget
don't
their
think so
victims,
either. I think
but
yeah, right.
yeah, but it's pretty similar around the world. There's a couple of models and sort of in process of crime and asset recovery, but it's pretty unanimous around the world that any agency that comes across an asset that they are currently holding and they seize, if they've demonstrated that that asset is likely from a illicit activity of some description. So the typical was the pile of cash found in a truck with narcotics. You're going to forfeit the cash every day of the week because it's clearly linked to criminality. Or the criminal can come forward and say why they left a big bag of cash on top of the kilos of cocaine, for example, and prove it's legitimate. So in those cases, the cash is just forfeited, and usually it's forfeited to the government. And in that case, in most government agencies, then there's a process for forfeited funds as to how it's redistributed within the government. In the UK, it goes to courts, and some goes to policing, and some goes to Home Office. And most countries have a similar tech model. And then same with virtual assets. If you encounter assets, forfeit those assets. The process in most certainly forfeiture applications I've been involved in, the process will usually be, can you verify that you've carried out the relevant checks to ensure that there isn't a third party claim over these assets? So a famous case that's in the public domain right now is the enormous, Metropolitan Police case where the 61,000 Bitcoin seized. Just simply
Mm.
incredible case, but it's widely reported in the public domain. I mean, there's literally, I think, thousands of reported victims of a Ponzi scheme in China who want their assets back and want their funds back. And that case is now going through the court process where there's been a indisputable, sort of excellent criminal investigation that resulted in a prosecution. I mean, people found guilty, assets seized. So now, if the UK then goes through the process of forfeiting those assets, it'll be, are there any victims? Yes, there are. So now they'll go through a process of verifying and validating. So the government doesn't get to take a piece on the top end, so to speak, but usually just exercising the forfeiture process means there'll be an attempt to identify victims. Sometimes it's court ordered that the victims will be repaid. So in the UK, we call it a compensation order or a confiscation. So it's either going to the government or going to victims. But then, obviously, quite rightly, if any government agency assists another government agency around the world recovering assets, there are legal mechanisms for those governments to get back a share of the proceeds because they've done the legal work, they've done the investigation, for example. So there's lots of legal mechanisms for those to get a distribution of some of the proceeds effectively. But irrefutably, if it's a victim's funds, the victims get their money back. And if it's an anti-corruption case and a foreign dictator's taking the funds, the foreign government will get their assets back. Um, but it all comes down to, and we see it a lot in crypto, fake victims. It comes down to people trying to falsely claim that it's their asset. But back to the attribution point, it's usually quite easy to verify that it was your asset because you probably still control the wallet it was stolen from or other like, proof of life points.
Yeah, that's interesting. For the entire audience here, if you've been a victim of one of these scams, crimes, whatever, you do need to make that report to the agency, and
Yeah,
that's because
precisely. Oh, yeah.
you want to get on that victim role, right? You want to be, victim support services or whatever, have them contact you, or whatever the case may be, because that's how they assess the restitution, right?
Well,
So you
even
want to make sure
even
that you
even
do
in
that.
your example around if the case doesn't get picked up because quite rightly there isn't enough resources to investigate every single case, but just by making that report and obviously a shout out to like Operation Shamrock if you're a victim of these cases, they have wonderful resources. There's a model through I think it's chain abuse where you can report for free your cases and agree with Iggy, report to law enforcement and the different sort of reporting portals because by doing that, it might be someone else in a different jurisdiction. Maybe their case gets picked up and you then are part of that victim pot. So even if you're not, but if you don't make that report, no one's ever going to be knocking on your door or sending you a letter or trying to get in touch with you. So yeah, it's very much worse making that claim, but we're all unanimously agreed that sadly the actual likelihood of any return is minimal.
Yeah, yeah. But make that report. It helps all the way around. It helps building cases, other cases, and it helps you get restitution should there be a seizure in the future. That's available for that. Gentlemen, I have one more question here. How do you investigate a forfeiture case when you have a money laundering scheme that involves multiple entities from several countries involved? Traditional banks. It says bio banks. I think that might be neobanks. I'm not sure. that operate crypto as well. So banks that have crypto as well, and a CEX. So I think Iggy might be good for that one.
With great difficulty. That's how you do it. Um,
Yeah,
you just have to follow where the money goes. It's an old adage, but it's very true. Whether that takes you weeks or months or days, you follow the money. You ensure that you have the right resources and right tools behind you and the right contacts. Going back to my point about just having a conversation, it's incumbent upon all investigators. It's not just about the tools that you have. Who do you know and where do you know them? Maintain that list. Take that with you from place to place. Leverage other people's contacts. You know, in the old days, and I am old enough to remember, used to have a Rolodex of all the people you've met at conferences, etc. And I still collect business cards. So that's how you investigate a forfeiture case. You have to have the contacts. You have to have the information. Where did the funds come from? And then build up that map of the flow of funds from victim or illicit act through to the end point. And the traditional financial investigation is no different in some respects to crypto. You find the entity, you paper the entity, you get the subpoena records, you follow the money, you go from point to point to point. And it has to be now, we can't be looking at it just as this is a crypto case, this is a fiat case. They will merge. The funds will come into the crypto ecosystem from cash because you can only buy, steal, or make crypto. And most people buy it. So you need to have
that's
those
exactly right.
networks and you need to be able to follow the money. And yes, it will be complicated, it will be difficult, but no more so than the most complicated fiat laundering case involving things, for example, the shell companies, remittance, Hawala banking, underground banking networks, etc., etc., etc. There's complexity on both sides of the fiat crypto divide.
Yeah, Iggy, I think you and I are both old enough to remember we carried the notebook in your pocket all the time, no matter what happened. And if you had a question about something that happened 6 months ago, you went and found your notebook from 6 months ago, and you flip through it to find a day, and you're like, "Oh, that's the guy's name right there. I found it." Yeah, those are days gone, but they were very fruitful because you could make those personal contacts. I hope that that's still going on. I'm not in the field anymore, but I hope that's still happening. Gentlemen, I'm going to follow this up. We have about 4 minutes. I'm going to follow up on just real fast on this one thing that everyone wants to talk about. So, is there any place right now, today, and maybe in the future, that you see AI delivering real measurable value in crypto investigations? And that goes for seizures as well, Aiden.
It's going to come down to the data analysis. AI and LLM tools are exceptional at big data analysis, and that's where you're going to leverage those capabilities to 10x you or your team's abilities. But what I would say is, with caution, the result still needs to be read by a human. You cannot let AI do everything because your actions will have real world consequences, either on an account holder, an entity, or, for example, a victim. So there has to be an element of checks and balances where human can review, because ultimately the human will be responsible for their actions, and that introduces a check and a balance against corruption, for example, or mistakes.
Yeah, mistakes. We don't need the mistakes in this world. And I keep saying that that kind of just free reign in AI will lead to bad case law. It will lead to bad things happening in courts, and they'll lead to restrictions that we don't need in this industry. So, Aiden, sir, you want to take up part of that?
Yeah, just on our side of the fence, it's much what we see is, I mean, our job is to deal with like the weird margin cases. You know, someone asked a question about like privacy coins. We don't service retail or institutional. Our regulatory permissions means that when we're doing the government cases, we can do things like the Moneros of the world. We see one of the most commonly seized asset is USDT on Tron, and is it being seized because it is available in sort of a lot of the shady exchanges around the world. There's different correlations, but we see AI playing a part in the productivity piece. I mean, an average government asset seizure is not one address for Bitcoin, send it off. It's usually we've identified, 40 accounts linked to the individual with multiple assets attached to it. Then you've got a manual PDF court order that you've maybe received information from an exchange overseas. So being able to build into your workflows ways of extracting those addresses, being able to use that. But as Iggy said, we always insist there still has to be the manual user check of that. So on the asset recovery side, we're seeing AI and like agentic AI and giving guidance for how to seize assets and things like that. But they're more
Mm.
productivity related. the thing that keeps me awake at night is just we already struggle dealing with fraud globally. And now we're
Yeah.
seeing with AI, just it's just basically it's cheaper and easier to commit larger scale fraud. So hoping that like in the UK, we've got a banking levy across the world. There's no more investment because of asset recovery specific sort of legislation. Hopefully that gives law enforcement the tools and more resources because everyone's been talking about it for decades that we constantly underfund government agencies and then
Yeah.
expect them to deliver, and they deliver exceptional results with limited resource as it stands. But I think they definitely need more tools to be able to tool up and keep up the fight.
Yeah, absolutely. Money coming into agencies probably is not going to get a whole lot better overnight. So, got to do more with less. And I think AI is a multiplier there, but it's a multiplier that has to have close supervision. So, gentlemen, it is 1 hour exactly. We have done an excellent job on time management, and I think we've done a better job on the information we put out. So, it's been really, really good talking to both of you. I really appreciate your insight, and your knowledge is just, sharing your knowledge is what this is all about. And you two are probably one of the two. And there's a lot of really great people in this industry, but you two are definitely right up there at the top. So I appreciate it very much. And to the audience, thank you for joining us. Merkle Meets. We'll meet again. And thank you very much, gentlemen. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thanks for the
Thank you.
invitation. Thank you.